Thanks, Ceann Comhairle. Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world. It has an abundance of other natural resources, gold, bauxite, coltan. But obviously a lot of these resources under the hands of the Maduro government are not easily accessible by US and transnational corporations. Much of the oil industry was nationalised in 1973. And it's quite obvious that this latest coup attempt, because let's remember it's not the first or the only one, the latest coup attempt has been done to get the hands on Venezuelan oil. And I have to say I felt absolutely sick listening to the points that Niall was making. It's not true to say that none of the opposition took part in the elections. Some of them did, and some of them recognised its fairness after all. But to whinge about elections not being fair and to support as an alternative somebody who assumed a position, who decided couldn't be bothered standing an election, comes along at the behest of their US puppet masters and says, do you know what, I'll be president. Well, Michael D. Higgins, the turnout in the presidential election in Ireland was 43%. In Venezuela, it was 46%. Do you think if I come along now and say, do you know what, Michael D. doesn't have a mandate, I'll be the president, do we want Donald Trump to come in here and support that over the heads of the Irish people? Because where are the Venezuelan people? They're out on the streets in their millions saying, Yankee, go home. They're saying, hands off Venezuela. They've seen it before. They've seen it in Chile. They've seen it in the interventions in Syria and so on. And I am really sickened to the pit of my being about this one. I think this is a game changer if this is allowed to go ahead. I remember when we were elected here first and we came in here, and I remember Lucinda Creighton standing there and telling us to support the initiative of our European pals in the bombing of Libya. It was for democracy. It was going to make things better for the Libyans. Look at the state of that country now. The amount of people who have been killed. The society is a basket case. It's in absolute disarray. We've been to Iraq. We've seen the aftermath of the slaughter of the intervention in Iraq. We've been to Syria twice in the last number of years and have seen the outcome of the intervention there. Will we please stop meddling in the business of other countries? I noticed Niall didn't say anything about the Italians or the Greeks or the people who stood by the elected government of Venezuela and said back off. They're not going to recognise the impostor Guaido. Now, there are enormous problems in the Venezuelan economy. There's enormous problems in our economy, but you know what? The Venezuelans actually managed to build 2 million social houses last year, so they're doing obviously some things right. But the cause of that problem is the sanctions imposed by the West. And we have the report by the recent UN Special Rapporteur, who's the first person to be in Venezuela in 21 years undertaking such a project, and he is very, very clear about what he saw last year about the situation in Venezuela. He said the sanctions are illegal. They could amount to crimes against humanity under international law. This is the former Secretary-General of the UNHRC and an expert in international law. It's the sanctions that are killing people. It's the orchestrated sanctions that have put pressure on the economy, that have forced people to emigrate, that have caused a run on medicines and all of the economic problems that are there, as well as interference with the currency problems, orchestrated in order to weaken the leadership, an attempt that they failed to do under Chavez, now moving in under Maduro. If we were truly neutral, we'd stand in Europe and say, back off, keep out, we should take a lead from the Greeks and the Italians and not slavishly follow the rest of it. I think it's an absolute appalling situation.
Thank you, Deputy Daly, for observing the time. Ministers, 4 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the deputies opposite last Ceann Comhairle, and I apologise on behalf of Taoiseach and Minister for Foreign Affairs Simon Covey have been unable to be here today as he is abroad. The Government continues to be deeply concerned by the political, economic, social and humanitarian crisis in Venezuela. This crisis continues to have a grave impact on the Venezuelan people and has resulted in mass migration affecting countries in the region and overall regional stability. Particularly distressing is the human impact of this crisis. The UN estimates that over 3 million people, approximately 1/10 of the entire population, have already left the country, and the acute humanitarian needs within the country are well known, particularly in relation to the shortages in excess of medicine, significant increases in malaria, infant and maternal mortality and acute malnutrition. On the 10th of January, President Maduro started a new mandate on the basis of an undemocratic elections held in May 2018. Ireland was not represented at the inauguration and fully supported the related declaration of the EU High Commission Representative Federica Mogherini, which urged President Maduro to release all political prisoners, to uphold the rule of law, human rights and fundamental freedoms, and to urgently address the needs of the population. Ireland, alongside our EU partners, has repeatedly called on the Venezuelan government to engage in dialogue with the opposition, to respect the electoral calendar and to fully restore the country's democratic institutions. It is regrettable that the Venezuelan government has not heeded these calls for fresh presidential elections in accordance with internationally recognised democratic standards and the Venezuelan constitutional order. Ireland fully supports the most recent EU 28 statements made by the HRVP on the 26th of January, which reiterates that a peaceful and inclusive democratic solution is the only sustainable way out of the current crisis, and reaffirms the full support of the EU to the democratically elected National Assembly. It stated that if no announcement regarding fresh elections were to be made over the intervening days, the EU would take further actions, including regarding the issue of recognitions of the country's leadership. In the absence of such an announcement, Ireland has joined other EU member states in acknowledging and supporting Mr Juan Guaidó, President of the democratically elected National Assembly, as President ad interim of Venezuela. In order for him to call for free, fair and democratic presidential elections, the Taoiseach announced today that he intends to speak to Mr Guaidó to communicate our position. Ireland is committed to finding ways to foster shared democratic solutions that can bring political stability and address the pressing needs of the Venezuelan people, including by increasing EU humanitarian support. A credible, meaningful dialogue leading to an inclusive democratic solution is the most effective way of achieving a peaceful, sustainable resolution of the current crisis in Venezuela. Ireland also supports the remarks made by the High Representative Mogherini following the informal meeting of EU foreign ministers in Bucharest on the 31st of January last, including regarding further EU actions to increase humanitarian support and consider additional targeted sanctions. In conclusion, the HRVP also took this opportunity to announce the establishment of the EU of an international contact group for Venezuela, Ireland, while not seeking membership, welcomes its establishment and believes that the ICG will be a useful vehicle for facilitating dialogue and working towards a democratic solution. I look forward to the report of the first meeting of the ICG to be held in Montevideo on this Thursday. I welcome the high priority given to the issue by the EU and the regular consultations at the highest level on developments on the ground. And in conclusion, Ireland will remain in close contact with our EU partners to consider the next steps for a coordinated EU
Collins is 2 minutes.
Thanks, Corla. Minister, you didn't really address the questions that I raised in your response there, and I'd appreciate if you could maybe address them in your supplementary reply. But what a bunch of balderdash last Cahireach that we've heard from Deputies Wallace and Daly. They want to have it every way. They want to be against everybody and for nobody. But we stand for the Venezuelan people. That's what we're standing for. And they're happy to see the political and the civil chaos and upheaval that goes on and say that we're all hypocrites. And they're right. They're as bad as Sinn Féin. The fact of the matter is, law and order, civil society is breaking down in Venezuela. And what we have said is, let's support the interim presidency of Juan Guaidó. And let's call for fresh elections and let the Venezuelan people decide. Elections that are fair, open, transparent. So you can't be against everybody and against everything and for nothing. And I haven't heard any credible solutions coming from either Deputies Wallace or Daly, because they just want to bring in a whole load of other competing agendas into it also. But that's fine. What I'd like to know, Minister, is this. Why did it take the Irish Government so long to come to this position? What will we do, and what will the EU do, and what will Ireland's position be if we're not getting open and transparent elections in the foreseeable future, which is what the Venezuelan people want, by the way? And finally, can you give us some kind of a commitment in relation to humanitarian aid? Thanks.
Wallace has 2 minutes.
Thanks, Corla. Just in relation to the Tánaiste there, I'm just sorry that Simon actually eventually gave in to the pressure from the Americans. But anyway, we'll see how it develops. In 2015, Obama introduced sanctions against the Maduro government. The sanctions were designed to make the people suffer by depriving them of food and medicine and depriving the government of money to run the country. That's what they were designed for, and that's been ongoing since. And if Venezuela is in a difficult place today, they can thank US sanctions for doing so. Yeah, what do we want? Are we against everything? No, we're not. We're actually in favour of democracy, and we think that people of Venezuela should decide their destiny, decide their future, and they should pick their president, and they shouldn't have them picked by the Americans. So I wonder if someone from, we'll say, Macron, supposing he had a row with Trump and he decides to nominate Saunders for President of America, and then looks for backing and say, oh, we'll recognise him now. Until it's a fresh, we want elections straight away, we'd like him very quickly now, in a couple of months. I mean, the notion that the Americans would actually pull a fella over the hat and say, here's the new president of America, of Venezuela, and the notion that Fianna Fáil would actually go along with him is unbelievable. I mean, I don't understand where these people come from. Are they living under a rock? Like, I mean, did they learn anything from supporting the intervention in Libya? Did they learn anything from the regime change effort in Syria? Did they learn anything from the demolition that they supported in Afghanistan by allowing Shannon to be used to destroy hundreds of thousands of lives in Afghanistan? Are Fianna Fáil ever going to learn anything? Is it any wonder that Leo is not even afraid of them?
Deputy Daly.
Thanks, Count Corla. I think there's something incredibly hypocritical in talking about undemocratic elections coming out of the mouths of the same people who've no problem at all in having any dealings with people who don't even bother masquerading that they're going to go through an election, the likes of Bin Salman, some of the other friends that the West has no problem engaging in. So what's the criteria of democracy now, according to the Irish government? Whatever the Americans decide on a certain morning, whoever they decide to back, well, that's all right, Jack, that's good enough for us. Now, Venezuelan economy is in a very difficult place at the moment. The recent visit by the UN Special Rapporteur made the point that modern-day economic sanctions and blockades are comparable with medieval sieges of towns, with the intention of forcing them to surrender. 21st sanctions, not to bring a town, this is to bring a sovereign country to its knees. And that's what this effort at sanctions is attempting, and it's the Venezuelan people who are suffering as a result. But where are they? The poorest of them are out in the streets in their millions, standing by the government, difficulties and all, and there are huge difficulties. So what's the solution, and what are we for? Venezuelan society is incredibly divided. Actually, you could say the opposition have been called, not exclusively, but in the main, it is in somewhat a revolt of the rich, but not exclusively. The society is incredibly divided. So there has to be talks, there has to be negotiations, but in order to do that properly, the sanctions themselves have to be called off. They have to be allowed to develop their economy without the blackmail of that situation continuing. And I think, you know, for us to take part in the undermining of a sovereign nation is terrible indictment for us who almost, in the same breath, recognise 100 years of parliamentary democracy here in Ireland. It's absolutely shocking. Have we learned nothing from all of the coup attempts around South and Latin America over the past number of years?
Minister,
and I really hope that we take a different tack.
2 minutes for a concluding statement.
Thank you very much, Les Kincorla. Let me reiterate that Ireland has continuously voiced its support for the democratically elected National Assembly of Mr Guaidó was elected President last month, as well as urging Nicolas Maduro to fully respect and restore the independence and powers of the National Assembly. Ireland is committed to finding ways to foster shared democratic solutions that can bring political stability and address the pressing needs of the Venezuelan people, including by increasing EU humanitarian support. A credible, meaningful dialogue leading to an inclusive democratic solution is the most effective way of achieving a peaceful and sustainable resolution of the current crisis in Venezuela. As I outlined in my original reply, the people of Venezuela are living through this crisis. The recent protests are a demonstration of the Venezuelan people and their demand for a proper democracy, and it is imperative that the right to freedom of expression and peaceful assembly are respected. And I wholly condemn the use of violence against these protesters by the Venezuelan authorities. And I would like to offer my condolences to the families of the victims and call on the authorities to refrain from the disappropriate use of violence against peaceful protesters. Ireland supports urgent measures to address the humanitarian crisis and reiterates calls for humanitarian actors to be allowed to operate without interference to ensure that the utmost is done to mitigate against the grave effects of the crisis and alleviate the suffering of the Venezuelan people to the greatest extent possible. We will continue to consult closely with our EU partners at the highest level on this issue. The days and weeks ahead are crucial for the future of the people of Venezuela, and Ireland, in step with our EU partners, has emphasised the right of the Venezuelan people to freely choose their future. And let me say that the Taoiseach and the Department of Foreign Affairs will remain in close contact with the EU counterpart to follow this absolutely extraordinary issue.
Deputy